really super excited about today's Sunday with Mundy. I think more so than any of the previous events that I've sponsored, in good part, of course, because of the topic. And I realize that this is different, but I also think it is very, very important. I said in a note to Christopher and Roger a couple weeks back that we all know that there's a kind of expansion that's going on in consciousness now. It's been going on for a long time, but it seems to be speeding up. And one of the ways that this is speeding up is in terms of the death of institutions like the church, because I think very seriously, people are just looking for deeper, deeper answers and not something that's rule ridden and laws and creeds and dogmas and regulations, but a kind of openness and kind of freedom and another way of seeing. And not only that, but it is experiential. So, the faster it gets, the faster it gets, which is just phenomenal. We're really at a time of significant change, and psychedelics are part of that change. And we can't ignore that fact is here and in front of us. So I'm really happy to have Roger Walsh and Christopher Bache. I'm going to let them introduce themselves a little bit more formally, but just to say right off the bat, they are both professors emeritus. Roger from UC Irvine School of Medicine, where he taught psychiatry and philosophy and anthropology. Chris, professor emeritus from Youngstown University, where he was teaching courses in philosophical studies and religious studies as well. And it was really Chris's book that got me around to thinking about doing this, and that book would have been this book, LSD and the Mind of the Universe. Was so phenomenal that I actually listened to it twice because there's just so much to gather from the book. And so I decided I really want to do this. And then I thought it'd be really good if Roger could be here as well, because he has background in this field as well. And I haven't read all Roger's books, but most recently, this book has been sitting on my shelf for a long time. And so just the last few weeks, I listened to it as I was driving the car. And then they go back on the shelf. But I'm just super, super happy that both of these guys are with me today. They know so much about this topic that we're going to be exploring. Okay, so welcome, Roger and Chris. Let's see where we're going to go today. Maybe I'll start with Chris, only because, Chris, it was because I read your book that I just decided that we had to talk about this. And I wouldn't have made the decision if it weren't for the fact that back in 1966, when I was going to seminary in Southern California, School of Theology in Claremont, California, I had the opportunity to go up into Mount Baldy and sit on a couch in front of a fireplace one evening and have my first LSD experience. And it was just phenomenal. It was a very deep spiritual experience. I was working my dissertation at the time on the works of Ph.D. and his ideas about the growth in consciousness. And I could just sort of see what he was talking about in another dimension. And I'm sure you know better than I do what I'm talking about, actually. And then in 1976, 10 years later, I had a profound ego death experience in the jungles in Chiapas in southern Mexico with Mexican psychiatrist Dr. Salvador Roquette. And that was quite frankly, without doubt, the most significant, profound experience of my life. Because it really, I thought I had died. I mean, I was going to die, and I did die because I couldn't stop it. Couldn't reverse the process. Yeah. But what it showed me, like I had gotten the Course in Miracles just a month or so before that, but I did no world. Come on, no body. I mean, no time. None of this is making sense. But after that, it made sense. All right. So enough of that. Tell us a little bit about your work and why and how you've been doing it and how things are looking, and well, just respond to what I've been throwing out there.
Well, first, John, it's a real pleasure to be in your show today and to be in dialogue with Roger and you and Bud and to be with all these people. It's a true honor. I recognize the unorthodox and potentially controversial nature of the topic that we're talking about today. And I really respect communities that are willing to open to this topic because I think it is an important topic. I think psychedelics are changing. They represent a fundamental turning point, not only in psychology and psychotherapy, but they represent a turning point in the doing of philosophy. I was trained as a philosopher of religion. And I got a very traditional education. I was raised in the Deep South. I had a very traditional education, the Ivy League and whatnot. I did not get into psychedelics seriously, I mean, at all really, until I had started my teaching career. And I had begun as a young academic in Ohio. And I read Stan Grof's work. And Stan Grof's first book, Realms of the Human Unconscious, was a turning point for me. And he convinced me that if you use these substances in a disciplined, therapeutically structured way, you could use them to safely explore the deep structure of your own psyche and what your psyche is part of. And so I thought that was really important as a philosopher professionally. So I began to work with psychedelics following Stan Grof's paradigm. Over the next 20 years, between 1979 and 1999, when I was 30 to 50 years old, I did 73 high-dose LSD sessions, completely internalized, isolated, with a sitter, carefully controlled situation, recording my experiences within 24 hours. After I was done in 1999, I took another 20 years to think about, reflect upon these experiences before publishing the book that you showed, LSD and the Mind of the Universe. I'd published other books along the way. There's a book on reincarnation, which I think is just a really fundamentally important topic for people today. There's a book called Dark Night, Early Dawn, which is describing, engaging some of my early psychedelic experiences in the context of other people's work. And there's a book on the living classroom, on fields of consciousness and how these fields manifest in the group. So, but all of my life has basically been centered around the systematic cultivating and careful digesting of non-ordinary states of consciousness triggered by psychedelics, reflecting on their properties and trying to integrate them into our philosophical and spiritual traditions. So that's how I came here today.
Great. So before we go to Rod, you want to tell us just a little bit about what you found in this study that you were doing? What really began to turn things around for you?
Well, you know, that's hard because
I know it'd be hard. It's bound to be hard.
I mean, Aldous Huxley wrote his really beautiful and important book, The Doors of Perception, after only one mescaline experience. And when you do 73 or any long number of such experiences, you break through barrier after barrier after barrier. So you're ushered, our universe is so vast, my experience at least, is that it's so vast, it has so many levels, spiritual reality has so many levels, they operate on different, in different modes, and you're initiated sequentially one after another, beyond into the depths of your personal unconscious, beyond that into the species mind, the dynamics of the collective psyche, beyond that into the dynamics of archetypal reality, and then beyond that into what I would call the causal oneness, the fundamental core oneness, where the entire universe with all of its diversity, as Plato said, breathes as one. Plotinus, I believe, breathes as one. The whole universe moves as one. And then, at least in my experience, the last 5 years of my work were spent being immersed in what I came to call the diamond luminosity. That is the field of light that is the matrix within which the physical universe arises and dissolves second by second. The closest philosophical or spiritual correlate that I could find was what Buddhism calls Dharmakaya, the clear light of absolute reality. And so that really was when I talk about Diamonds from Heaven, which is the subtitle of the book, which is really in my heart of hearts, it's really the title of the book. The diamonds that I'm referring to are the experience of this diamond consciousness, a super, super clear, luminous, clear beyond imagination, which then the question becomes, what's the relationship between this diamond luminosity and the divine or God, which is a real a question I've wrestled with for a long time. So this is the course, the agenda that I did, the protocol I followed. I truly do not recommend it today. I would recommend a gentler course. I was pushing a boundary that without much support of elders and learning as I went. Knowing what I know today, I would be gentler. I would work with lower doses and gentler psychedelics. So just let me add that footnote in the beginning.
That's interesting. So, Roger, you want to tell us a little bit about your background here more than I did before, and how it all connects to, first of all, you've been deeply involved with the Course in Miracles for a very long time. Really appreciate the gifts of the healing and that stuff that you did on the Course. And I know that your wife, Frances Vaughn, was very involved with the Course as well. Also had her experiences with psychedelics. You want to bounce a bit off of Roger and myself, and off of Chris and myself?
Yeah, well, I think Chris in his two-minute download there gave us enough to talk about for the next 2 hours easily. So,
well, we've got to start. Let's go.
we could just go off from there. Let's see. As to my own background, I was born in Australia, raised there, had a very conventional, traditional Australian beer drinking culture. Very nothing spiritual whatsoever. I thought spirituality was the opiate of the masses, to quote Marx. I would have dismissed everything I now believe in as total nonsense. And then I came to California, and California has a way of changing people, and myself included. I went to Stanford to do my psychiatry training, and as part of my training, I went into psychotherapy. I was doing therapy on people. I didn't really think it did much, but I figured I had a moral obligation to at least try it myself. I had the extremely good fortune of going into therapy with a very skilled master therapist by the name of Jim Bugenthal, a humanist existentialist. And he just opened up the universe to me and blew me out of the water. And I was just mind boggled to find there was an inner world, actually an inner universe, as vast and mysterious as the outer, that I had spent my entire life absolutely in ignorance of the fact that there was this inner world of imagery, of thoughts and images and emotions and feelings, all of which were not something to be feared, as I and the culture had assumed, but rather could be sources of wisdom and guidance and healing and insight. That there were reservoirs of wisdom and depths to us that none of my psychiatry texts had more than alluded to. That there were reservoirs of wisdom we could draw on far beyond anything I had even guessed, and that the culture seemed to know anything about. And I was left, frankly, just stunned, because at that time, this was in the 70s, there just weren't a lot of people who had opened in this way. I literally felt as though I'd spent my entire life living on the top 6 inches of a wave on top of an ocean I didn't even know existed. And I had no context, I had no framework. I didn't know people who were doing contemplative practices. I probably would have thought they were nuts if I had. So I kind of groped around, found my way into humanistic psychology, heard of transpersonal psychology, where my wife-to-be, Frances Vaughn, was actually president of the Transpersonal Psychology Association at that time. And And I threw myself into an exploration of all the isms that California has to offer. And for about 2 or 3, 4 years, whatever there was to do, I did it. You name it, TA, TM, Esterica, chanting, meditation, Gestalt. I mean, it's a long, long list. My weekends were just filled with workshops and trainings, and I literally did. I did an awful, just dove into doing a lot of exploring, and eventually found myself ending up in with people like Muktananda chanting and trying to do meditation, and I couldn't for the hell of me understand why I was associating with these weird relics of primitive thinking, because I knew religion was an opiate to the masses and just a relic of primitive thinking. But why the hell was I associating with? Why did it seem to work? And it took me, I really had to wrestle with this. And there was literally one moment as I was crossing the living room floor one evening when I suddenly hit me that behind the religious institutions with their conventional rituals and dogma and myths were these far less well-known practices for training the mind and heart to induce the same states of consciousness, realizations, capacities, and virtues that the founders had discovered. And that there was really a spiritual psychotechnology for inducing altered states and qualities and capacities and virtues that were transformative. And that, and then I was blown away to realize, well, how come no one knows about this? This is incredibly important. And yet our culture is absolutely blind to our inner universe and to the ways of practicing and cultivating our capacities. And so then I spent years trying to first personally diving into these practices and more moving into contemplative practices, and same time intellectually and professionally trying to understand this and make sense of it and draw bridges between conventional mainstream psychology and for example contemplative practices, meditation and Buddhist psychology and philosophy, which I was studying, and yoga and Confucianism, all these traditions which seem to know way more about the mind and how to train it and hone it than any of my psychiatry texts. So it was just it was a weird time. And gradually I began to see how things fitted together and began to write about syntheses. And also at that time, there were a number of brilliant people emerging like Ken Wilber, who has produced probably the most comprehensive integrative map we have of integrating various disciplines, psychology, philosophy, religion, spirituality, etc., into sophisticated integrated maps. Then there was as Chris mentioned, there was a book of Stan Grof's that came out on psychedelics and his vast synthesis. And so there are people emerging, popping up all over the place who were making similar explorations and making their own far more sophisticated syntheses that I could then begin to draw on. And my wife, my to-be wife, Frances Vaughan, was studying a course, and I opened it and very open-mindedly saw the words God and Holy Spirit, said no thank you. And but then I was, over the next couple of years, I was around a number of people who would drop these great one-liners and quotes, and I would say, wow, that's fantastic, where'd you get that from? Course in Miracles. And then I went to a talk at a psychiatric conference where Bill Thetford had been invited to teach, to give a talk. And I listened, and there was something about this guy. I still don't know what, but I remember the thought arose, okay, if this guy's into the course, I've got to try it. And it took about a month to get through the conventional Christian language. But once I did, it just opened up. The beauty of the language became apparent. the depth of the material and the transmission became apparent. And I've been studying it daily for 40 years now. It just is one of my major components of my path. I should just perhaps add that personally and professionally, well, I'll back up and say each of us tends to vary in our approach to different practices and ways of learning and growing. And some like to just dive deep into one. Others like to dabble or taste from different sources. I'm more of a dabbler. I love to imbibe different traditions and get a feel for them, and then I may dive in for a while, and but then I like to, it feels nice to draw back and see how that relates to other paths and practices. And one of the, so I've basically personally and professionally been an explorer of the world's great contemplative traditions, and feel extremely fortunate to be alive in a time when one can do that. First, to have all the traditions available to us, and literally, Ken Wilber and I had a conversation. When was the last time there was a place like San Francisco where you could literally imbibe from the world's spiritual traditions? And the best we could come up with was Alexandria 2,000 years ago.
Wow.
We tend to forget how rare it is in
Yeah.
history to have the opportunity we have to draw on these traditions. So I've been interested in how the Course relates to these other things. And as part of that, these curious chemicals, psychedelics, which their extraordinary mind manifesting capacities keep kind of poking in from various places. So at various times I've done a number of research studies on them, including asking people who had awakening experiences, both conventionally and psychedelically, to compare them and what their advice was. And just to telegraph the result, what they had to say was, these substances can be very valuable if they're done in the context of a practice.
Right.
Not casually, but if in the context of a practice. And that's the way Chris has done it. And I think I'll just end by saying, I spent some time over the last few days going back and diving into Chris's book. And I just came out once again with, Chris, deep respect for the, really, truly, the courage and commitment and idealistic way in which you approach these substances and opened yourself to the deepest experiences that were available to you and were available to any human being, is just a model of spiritual exploration for me, and a true inspiration. And I truly want to acknowledge and thank you for your courageous exploration and what you brought back as a gift to all of us.
Thanks,
Thank
Roger.
you. It touches me deeply.
So, you know, what's exciting here, I think, and what you're talking about, Roger, is the depth to which we can go into. I mean, I've also been somebody who spent my life kind of comparing. I started teaching comparative religions many years, 45, 50 years ago, more than that probably. And I love looking at, a few weeks ago, we had on someone who's deep into Zen, practicing Zen, 45 years of sitting Zen, right? And there's some remarkable similarities between Zen and the Course. And I think we probably all agree that the Course in Miracles is the most profound psychological document, at least this is my thought, that's ever crossed the face of this planet in terms of where it's going and where it's taking us. And, you know, I still read the Course after 45 years. And I still go, wow, and oh my God, and look at that. I mean, it happens this morning as I was doing the lesson 190. It was like, well, there's a sentence there. What is that? Why didn't I get more deeply into that sentence a long time ago, right?
Yeah, where was I the last time I read this?
Yeah, right, you know, it's like that. But then also what happens with psychedelics in terms of where that can take you, it's very, very deep. It takes you to another world. I mean, it helps you to see that this world is something we made up, which is exactly something that the Course in Miracles is saying. This is a projection of our minds but you can't, it's very hard to see that until you see that. I don't know how else to express that, you know. Once you get a kind of objective sort of point of view where you can begin to see. So let's go a little bit more into where is this going? I mean, where's the course taking us ultimately? Where is psychedelic research taking us? And by the way, one of you might want to say something about psychedelic research that's going on now in terms of where it's being done and what kind of discoveries they're making and how they're being able to use it to treat it in mental health in particular. I don't know which one. Chris, you want to pick up on that?
You know, I'm thinking, Roger, you might be better versed to be able to describe, because the current focus of the work is in therapy, it's in psychotherapy, and it's bringing it to bear on very tenacious and difficult to treat psychological conditions. You want to pick up on that, Roger? Or?
Well, I can say briefly, although I don't feel really on top of the latest research, but I think that's true. There is now a renaissance. There were, we have a failed cultural memory that there was well over 2,000 studies done on psychedelics back in the early 60s, 70s, with very promising clinical results. Now, we need to qualify that and say that by contemporary research standards, the standards in research have gotten tighter and tighter, which is appropriate. Most of those studies would be regarded as preliminary at best, but they were extremely suggestive of remarkable therapeutic potentials for for a number of disorders, such as addictions, for example, that are very hard to treat, or end of life anxiety. And now we have a beginning of those kind of studies returning again. We've had several studies for people at the end of life for dealing with terminal anxiety with very promising results. We've had some promising studies with addiction, but in addition, there have been some studies at the Johns Hopkins Center which have really looked at the spiritual potentials of psychedelics, and that's quite remarkable. First, they were allowed to do that, but it's also a beautiful follow-up to the studies in the 60s, such as the famous, what's called the I'm blocking on the name now, Chris, the study at Harvard, what was it called?
Oh, what was it called? Yeah, I know.
Harvard Good Friday study.
Yeah.
Did a study with a group of theological students in the Harvard chapel, and half of them got psychedelics, half of them got a placebo, and still with a 20-year follow-up, the majority of participants who got the active psychedelic rated as one of the most important experiences of their life, which is what you said earlier, John, and I'm sure we'll hear more about your perspective on that, Chris. So the studies are beginning again, which is wonderful, and they're being done very carefully. Hopefully there won't be, hopefully there won't be, hopefully it will, the studies will continue in a way which meets all the rigors of contemporary research requirements and consequently allows them to be used under appropriate therapeutic settings for what looks like real therapeutic potentials.
Yeah. And to me, when you place this work in the context of more traditional shamanic cultures, on the one hand, it validates the potential that these substances have to heal the traumas of the personal psyche, post-traumatic stress and addiction and the alienation caused by the modern worldview and the reductionistic material worldview. And we all carry wounds in our psyche, and these substances amplify consciousness. And if you use that amplified consciousness in a constructive way to confront those tensions and those wounds, then it accelerates the healing of those wounds and the restoration of healthy balance. But the same dynamics that allow you to heal the strains or the wounds of the personal psyche, if you continue this regimen, if you continue the systematic exploration, we find that you can go deeper and deeper within your consciousness until eventually you pass a membrane of your personal mind, but the process continues and the experiences broaden and intensify, where you realize you're not operating within your anything to do with your personal consciousness or even sometimes it's your soul consciousness, the deeper history of your incarnational history. But if you go deeper, you open up and you're in humanity's history. You're in the history of the human species, and the wounds which seem to come forward in that type, at least in my experience, the wounds are the wounds of humanity's history. They're the wounds of all the memories that are still being held in the collective psyche, of all the wars, of all the violence, of all the terrible things we've done to each other. And one can, by experiencing these collective wounds, one can bring some small measure of healing to the collective psyche, in the same way that by bringing awareness to your personal wounds, you can bring healing to the personal psyche. Now, right now, I think we're starting this journey intellectually, clinically, psychotherapeutically. We're starting the journey, and everyone is being very careful not to press the metaphysical boundaries too quickly, because if you press the metaphysical boundaries of the modern era, people get upset. And but I think if we keep pressing these boundaries methodically, we will basically reproduce the insights that were generated in the early years of research that Roger was talking to, in which we learn that these substances allow us to explore the very nature of consciousness itself. And that what we find is that it's not only human beings in higher mammalian forms that are conscious, but the entire universe is conscious. The entire fabric of reality is conscious, and that the consciousness, which is the life force behind and within physical reality, is rooted in a deeper metaphysical life force, which is the being, or I hesitate to even call it a being, because that shrinks it too much, but the vast creative intelligence, the vast power, which is the matrix that gave birth to time and space and continues to give birth to the evolving life inside time and space. But of course, to talk like that makes scientists uncomfortable. And so we have to earn, I think, again, the right to talk like that. And I think that's what we're in the process of doing. We're at the early stages of what will become a long journey.
Can I say that I think that one of the things that happens with both of these two separate fields is that what they do is they make you face yourself. I mean, you get right down to it. Projection makes perception, but we just can't go there, because then you become aware of your insanity, and becoming aware of your own personal, I'm talking about the ego's insanity now.
Yeah.
Then you can do something about it. It's interesting that psychedelics have been very helpful in drug addiction, in alcohol addiction, and depression, in places where other people weren't able to have success, simply because it puts it up in your face, and you can't be projecting and denying and saying the problem's out there somewhere. And I've got to go inside here, and this is where the healing occurs. You agree with that, Roger? Chris?
Yeah. Yes. There's a general principle in both psychotherapy and in contemplative work, contemplative and spiritual work, which is, to quote Fritz Perls, the founder of Gestalt therapy, awareness in and of itself is healing. And some of the general principles, the way the mind works, is that what you're unwilling to experience sticks around in the mind until you are willing to experience it. And second, what you're unwilling to experience runs your life. So much of what we do in therapeutic settings, whether psychedelic, whether psychotherapeutic, whether spiritual, is to provide safe containers in which people can feel cared for, supported, and safe, in which they can allow themselves to experience that which they've previously been unable or unwilling to experience. and thereby, by bringing into the healing light of awareness, allow experiences to emerge, to unfold, to unravel, and to resolve. And that's a core central element of healing process in multiple traditions.
Yeah, yeah. You know, and I would want to differentiate three different tiers in a way of working with psychedelics, or three different projects. And there are many, many ways to work with psychedelics, of course. And some people are working with psychedelics to augment creativity and so on and so forth. But to me, three tiers stand out. One is the therapeutic applications of psychedelics, which Roger has been describing, the healing of the personal psyche and reaching deeper than often traditional methods are able to reach. But the second is spiritual awakening, where it's not a matter of simply psychological healing, but going deeper and coming to an awakening of who we are underneath our personal history, what we are, what is the deeper truths of life, the deeper truths of ecstatic awareness, of compassion, and what we are doing here in the first place. What is the very nature of the fabric of the human experiment in the first place? And we see this in, for example, in the collection of essays, Zigzag Zen, which is a dialogue between the Buddhist community and the psychedelic community around enlightenment and psychedelics, helpful or hurtful, so on and so forth. But it turned, and I was really interested primarily in the spiritual applications of psychedelics when I began my work. But what happened in my work is that because the method I had adopted was so powerful, I was working at 500 to 600 micrograms consistently over these 20 years. And they were just evoking such deep states of consciousness that it shattered one boundary after another. And it took me through a long progression that was really not about healing. And after a while, after several years, not even about healing the human species, the human consciousness, but it was a matter of exploring the deep structure of cosmological reality itself. And the kind of teachings I received and the kind of communion I entered into, at least as I understood it, as I experienced it, was a communion with the creative intelligence itself, who wanted to share with me or to show me what had been going on for billions of years. And I apologize, I know that sounds outrageously egomaniacal, and I understand that, but this consciousness, each of my sessions began where the previous session stopped. It was like one long curriculum, one long study, and it would take me someplace again and again and again over several months and keep teaching me one set of issues or ideas until it was sure that I had grasped it. And then it would take me on. And after staying at a particular level of conscious reality, it would then put me through a gateway kind of initiation, another round of death and rebirth, in which there was another round of dying beyond ego death or beyond species ego death, and drop me into a whole new level of reality, which was very disorienting. And it would take me months, sessions, many sessions to learn how reality functioned at this new level of reality. And then it would teach me more. It would continue to teach me and take me and bend me in certain ways and give me access to certain things. So I began to realize that this was not really about spiritual awakening, and it wasn't about healing or even collective healing. It was about a kind of communion in which I had the opportunity to get, I was trained as a philosopher, so it was a philosopher's appetite that was being addressed, to understand the deep structure of reality, to understand why things are the way they are, and where we are in the human story, in the human evolutionary story. So that in my experience, time became permeable, very permeable, and I entered into different modalities of time. And so I entered into modalities of my personal history, but I also entered into time modalities of humanity's history, not only humanity's past, but humanity's future, and was given a series of consistent, stable teachings that went on for years about where humanity is, what's happening, what is this world crisis about, what is the underlying dynamic driving the world crisis, what is the potential for successful outcome of this crisis, which was nothing I ever imagined possible or would be part of these sessions. So it's just orders and orders and orders that unfold if one is willing to submit oneself to the rigors of the teaching. And the key to submitting to this process and the key to entering into these states is absolute to surrender. Whatever is asked, whatever presents itself, to let it into my awareness, to let it take me and do with me whatever it wanted to do with me, holding nothing back. And my experience was that it would reach a period, a culmination of crisis, a culmination of something really, really difficult, really hard. But then I would go through a death process, and then I would find myself alive at a new level of reality with new capacities as literally a new kind of being for the remainder of the session. It's a hard, in the early days, academics criticized psychedelics as getting spirituality on the cheap. They thought it was like chemical mysticism, easy access.
Yeah.
My experience is just the opposite. My concern is that psychedelics are such an intense form of the spiritual path that it can be too intense. You can bite off more than you can healthily chew, because nothing comes free in the universe. And that includes spiritual awakening, even in the context of pure grace. It's all grace. Existence is a grace. But in that context, the opportunities to awaken, the opportunities to become a more conscious participant in the flow of creation comes at a cost. And the cost is to surrender your smallness. And this is what all the spiritual teaches. We have to let go of being small in order to awaken to that in us, which is large.
Yeah.
That's kind of universal, isn't it? Awakening to the small, so you can. And I love the die before you die, so you don't die when you die. That's ancient sayings from mystics of all ages, right? But it doesn't seem like the process ends. You die and you come out, and then you die and you go back again.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the things which really stands out for me about your explorations, Chris, and your book, LSD and the Mind of the Universe, that the exploration and the deepening and the opening and the revelation just seemed endless. And you actually make the point that most traditions point to a specific realization or state of consciousness or as a final endpoint. And that's certainly my own understanding. If you look across traditions like, yes, that's it. And different, of course, different traditions have their different it, which makes things a little complex. But there is also a minority of people such as Dogen, who's the great Zen master, say, their enlightenment is endless. And more recently, one of the great, I think, sages and explorers of our time, Hamid, or goes by pen name Almas, his writing founded the Diamond School. He has put out one of his most recent books, Runaway Realization, where he says that he's a profound mystic, and he says, I keep having these openings and realizations, and people tell me, oh, that's the final one, but I always find it's just a portal to something more. And I think that is one of the hallmarks of your explorations, Chris, that every time you come to something like what could possibly be more, well, there was more. and and why should we think there's any limit to the creativity of the infinite?
Yeah.
So, and for all we know, even the most profound realizations of the great sages and your own very profound openings through psychedelics may have just been a tiny, tiny little drop of the infinite grace. Who knows? But I very much appreciate your openness to the possibility of endless openings, that each opening is just the portal, may perhaps be the portal to another opening.
Yeah, I think so. And even if we were to take a summation of the deepest spiritual experiences of the deepest human beings at this particular point in history of, say, the last 100 years, if we go forward in time 100,000 years, when I think humanity will be operating out of a different psychospiritual archetypal structure, the spiritual experiences and insights that we will be capable of in 100,000 years will be beyond what we are even capable of now, because the ability of the individual to access the deep structure of reality is in some ways hemmed in by the collective psyche's limitations, its evolutionary development. And if 100,000 years is too close, it's just take it out another million years or another 10 million years, because what we've been at this 13.7 billion years, and we're clearly just getting started. We only really woke up consciously that we could be able to reach into and access the common ground of consciousness about 5,000 years ago, and wake up to Atman is Brahman, wake up to our eternal nature, our essential nature, our awakened nature. And that's just a few thousand years ago. And once you look at the magnitude of the universe and the magnitude of the intelligence that's manifesting itself at every level of existence, then the human project expands into deep history. And I think this is one of the important values of reincarnation, because once you understand that our life is eternal, and that death is followed by birth, and there are things in between, but it's a constant growing and growing and growing process, then human existence blends into or becomes part of a deeper cosmological story, a cosmology of creation. Then we're not simply small players on a vast stage. We are eternal players on an eternal stage. At least that's what shows itself to me in my work.
Well, we're just about 2 or 3 minutes away from our break, our intermission, but let me just throw something in for most. So what is the next? I mean, like the next step, so to speak, and for humanity, I'm talking about, not for us as individuals necessarily, but as we continue to expand, I see churches dying. I see something new is coming in. How do you think this is going to be manifest? And then I'll take our break into this.
Yeah.
Either one of you or both of you.
Why don't you continue, Chris? You're kind of heading in this direction.
Right.
I was totally surprised to find that the story of humanity and where humanity is in history was one of the most recurring, stable set of insights that emerged in my work over many years. And I summarized this in a chapter called The Birth of the Future Human. And basically, if I were to boil it into a nutshell, it's this. The world that we live in now is a world that's been constructed by ego. And I think ego is a beautifully magnificent, important psychological structure. It gets a bad rap often, but really the ego is magnificent. It's a summation of our learning of any point in time, but it is fundamentally fragmented. It's fractured. It's cut off from other individuals and from the flow of life itself. And clearly the egos driving the world are driving the world to the point of the extinction, the potential extinction of the human species. We just have created a world that is so out of balance at the human scale and so out of balance with life itself and with the limits of the planet that we are truly threatening the existence of the human species. And there is a crisis building, and it's coming at us much harder and faster than we had thought even 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. It's just building with enormous speed and acceleration. It's taking us to our knees. And my experience in my sessions is that humanity is coming to a breaking point. It's coming to a point where it will absolutely no longer be able to continue life as we have known it in any way, shape, or form. Life is bringing us to our knees. It's breaking us open. We're going through an historical crisis. I don't know the details of it. I don't know the form of it. I know it's being driven by the ecological crisis, but it's a global systems crisis that will last generations. And my psychedelic experience, my visionary experience is that we don't go extinct. We come through this crisis. And in the process of going through this deep self-assessment and reassessment and rebooting and reorienting ourselves, we go through a spiritual breakthrough. We go through a tremendous pivot point where what happens in a psychedelic session where you go through a death, an absolute destruction of who you are, and then you awaken as a different being with different capacities, that this is happening collectively. Humanity is going through a death, and it's going to awaken as a higher form of humanity, the next iteration, just as we move from Homo habilis, eventually Homo sapiens, we're moving from Homo sapiens to something next. Now, at another level, another aspect of the teaching is that I think we are in the process of giving birth to the soul on earth, or what I call the diamond soul. That up to a certain point in our evolution, we die, we expand into consciousness, we are reborn, we get small, we get large, we get small, we get large, we get small. We learn, we experiment, we learn. We keep this up for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And when we die, we return to soul consciousness. When we're born, we return to egoic consciousness, back and forth, back and forth. Sooner or later, suddenly, gradually, sooner or later, I think it's the natural evolutionary progression that the soul, which is the consciousness that holds all of our life experience in all of our incarnations and all of the Bardo experiences, that mega consciousness wakes up inside a human incarnation. And I think this is what happens with Jesus. It's what's happened with the Buddha. They literally are living a larger consciousness. The soul wakes up inside a human incarnation. And at that point, we know to our bones, we know we are not simply a physical being. We know we have a history that predates this body and postdates this body. I think humanity is going through a transition where we are waking up from being a species of egos to a species of souls. And souls operate in a different modality. There is a depth of compassion. There is a depth of openness to the consciousness of the universe. And souls create a different culture than egos do. I literally think we are coming to a point in history where we can no longer afford the luxury of living small. We will have no choice but to live large. And this transition will be painful. But when we make this transition, it will trigger a shift in the architecture of the collective unconscious, in the archetypes which are awaking and guiding human experiences is very, very deep collective level. And then life will continue. We will continue to live, continue to grow, and we will continue to evolve, because whatever this transition is about, it's only our current transition. It will be followed by more transitions and more transitions, because the divine is not done with humanity. The divine is, we're in it for the long term.
Yeah.
So,
Thank God.
We're actually at the point of our intermission now.
The hush of heaven holds my heart today. The hush of heaven holds my heart today.
We'll break. And actually, I want to start by asking a question myself. We don't normally do this. We normally go right to Bud's talking about what came up in the chats. But there's just something that's sort of pressing for me. And that's a little difference between maybe what I hear in the Course in Miracles and what I hear from you, Chris. And it has to do with time, and it has to do with evolution. And the Course is really clear that in space-time, there are levels and dimensions, right? However, there's also the very clear statement that there's a perfection, that eventually we transcend levels. There are no levels or dimensions in heaven. It is a pure, perfected state. Now, I don't know, either one of you want to respond to that, and then we'll go to Bud's looking at what came up in the chats. Oh, you're on mute, Chris.
there, back.
Okay.
Time is one of the deep, deep riddles. And really, in my book, I talk about deep time. And deep time is not the same as eternity, not the same as timelessness. One can go into states of consciousness in which time is radically transcended, and the subjective experience is that you have entered into a timeless dimension, that there is no time whatsoever. In between that state and time-space, where every time is very linear and very directional, my experience has been that there are multiple modalities of time. There are different ways in which the universe is time conscious within itself. And so you can open up to time frames where you can experience 100 years as simultaneously present, or even 100,000 years as a framework with it's almost simultaneously present. So there are multiple modalities of time. And then if you go into the Bardo and the places where most people go when they die, in that intermediate state, there are different time modalities within that condition. I think it may be the case that beyond the Bardo, beyond all space-time reality, beyond the echoes of time-space reality in the Bardo, there is absolute timelessness, that time is simply part of the fabric of time and space, and it is absolute timeless. But it's also I think we have to hold open the possibility that what lies beyond space-time in the most radical sense and beyond the Bardo are permutations of creativity that include permutations of time that are beyond anything that we can imagine. And so I, for one, would be hesitant to wrap an absolute frame and say, this is what is real at an absolute level, for the reasons that Roger mentioned. To me, it's an open-ended mystery. Yeah.
Roger, you want to reflect on that, about the differences?
Well, first off, I just want to applaud Chris's closing line there, that it's a bottomless mystery, and because that's the way that's my understanding. Is that everything, wherever we look, whatever we probe, whatever we learn, it always points us to a deeper mystery. And that at bottom, life is a bottomless, 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 boundless mystery. And so I hold that that's the kind of context of my understanding for everything. And there's a school of philosophy that really spoke to that most deeply, and that's the school of Pyrrhonism, an ancient Greek philosophical school. And Pyrrho marched to India with Alexander's infantry. There he met the so-called gymnosophist, the Indian yogis, came back and started dressing in white, and was regarded as a very saintly person. In fact, he's kind of the patron saint of philosophers, because his native country decreed that they so respected him, they decreed that he should not have to pay taxes. So, but his central teaching was that at bottom, it's a mystery. One can say something, but nothing we say is really more than a pointer. And that, of course, is very congruent with what the Course says. And I think there's that beautiful line in the Course that time is a trick, a sleight of hand, a vast illusion. And yeah, so yes, that's as much as I can I can say. I think the only other thing to be added about the Course's description of heaven is it's not a very differentiated description. It's a kind of it's a description of all positive. So there's a contrast there with the kind of explorations that Chris did, where what was revealed was so many aspects or facets of beauty, truth, goodness. Each of them, as he writes in a couple of places, each of which he could have happily oriented his life towards. But the Course has more kind of this broad category of heaven as the all good. So I think there are some distinctions there that we could tease out further if we wanted to, but that's a starting point.
Okay. So Bud, let's go to you and see what did you see in the chat?
We have so many great questions. So
leave room for two people to talk. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, and a number of people have direct messaged me with questions. And so I've tried to put them together into a couple of common themes. So here's the top common theme. What does the mind-altering experience of psychedelics do that the seeker might not be able to get otherwise? In other words, can you experience this expansion, etc., without chemical assistance?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think yes. It's a complicated answer. It's a yes and no, but most importantly, it's a yes. These substances are only amplifiers of consciousness, and in the end, it's consciousness that does the work. So that the cosmology that emerges in psychedelic states is not a new cosmology. It's not unique. It's the same cosmology that emerges in our deepest mystical spiritual traditions. It's the same fundamental world. And the fact that deep meditators who are willing to commit decades, even lifetimes of exploring consciousness come up with a cosmology that is replicated in the scientific laboratory with psychedelics is significant, and I think it points to the true veridical nature of the world that we're exploring. So I don't think there's anything in my experiences which is unique or not found echoed in the spiritual experiences of people who have really lifelong contemplatives. And to me, I mean, I taught world religions all my life. I taught Buddhism all my life, comparative mysticism. And to me, the great spiritual saints and sages were always my role model. They always were the beings that I went back to get basic insights and help understanding the experiences that I was having. So yes, one can have these experiences without psychedelics whatsoever. And that much is very, very clear. At the same time, we're talking about many lifetimes. of work, pushing, really, really settling deeper and deeper and deeper into these deep states and these transformative conditions. And at the same time, there are certain of the experiences where you're breaking through time and breaking through levels of reality. I just want to acknowledge that are very rare, and even within the mystical traditions are considered to be very unusual in their own right. And I want to be very careful. The fact that you can have a very, very profound experience under the influence of psychedelics does not mean that you have become a profound person. And the fact that you may have a powerful mystical experience does not mean that you have become a mystic on the order of these other great contemplative mystics, because you've used a powerful amplifier, a temporary amplifying of your consciousness, where the other methods are kind of slow bake methods. They're kind of a slower, more gradual, but they result in a more sustained capacity. I always would want to emphasize that psychedelics are a method of temporary immersion. They are temporary, and one shouldn't confuse the experiences that emerge in a temporary condition, even though they are parallel, phenomenologically equivalent to what emerges in a meditative tradition. Don't confuse those two. They are arrived at through different methods. Roger, what do you think?
Yeah, I would agree completely, and bring in a couple of truly wise people who would speak to what you said. One is the great religious scholar Houston Smith, one of the great religious figures of the last century, who wrote one of the earliest articles on psychedelics, Do Drugs Have Religious Import? And his conclusion was, yes, it's clear that psychedelics can induce religious experiences. Quotes, it's less clear that they can induce religious lives. And so I think he was amplifying or pointing to the same point you are, that there's a difference between a temporary experience and a permanent transformation. And that there is always a challenge from one can think of a couple of major steps. The first step is to have an opening to a spiritual experience. The second is the challenge of stabilization. And stabilization can be as much a challenge as the original opening. Psychedelics are very good at fostering the original openings and multiple kinds of openings. But as Louis Pasteur said, chance favors the prepared mind, and the practices prepare the mind so as to have these kind of experiences, and to render the mind more likely to stabilize those experiences subsequently. You had also pointed, Chris, to the idea that the psychedelics tend to open people to the same realizations of the great saints and sages, and there's a beautiful little book by Stan Groff, who was the world's premier psychedelic researcher, which called The Cosmic Game, in which he took the people who'd had the deepest openings with psychedelics and put them together into a psychocosmology, a map of reality, actually a cosmo-ontology would be a technical word, a map of the cosmos and of the realm of nature of being. And it was a beautiful synthesis of so much information, very simple, very clear. I highly recommend it to anyone who would like to get a sense of both what psychedelics can open people to, and the understanding of reality that those openings plus the great religious sages point to as the nature of reality.
Bud, back to you. Thanks, Roger.
A couple of clarifications. You were talking, Chris, about the 3 different tiers: therapeutic utilization, spiritual awakening, and the third one I didn't quite get a title for. I called it communion with the mind of God. I mean, what is that third tier?
Cosmological exploration. To explore
Cosmological. Exploration. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, got it. All right. So now here's another question. And this is back to, actually, this is all of you. So we talk about the ego. We talk about some of the many challenges of being incarnate and the differentiation between being in body and not in body and where our awareness sits. You spoke, Chris, specifically about collective wounds. And one of the questions was, do you see this tied into the notion of the collective consciousness that Jung refers to? Is that where you see the collective wound sitting?
Yeah, I think so. Jung's profound insight was that all of our individual minds or psyches are contextualized within a collective mind, a collective psyche. And just as our personal pains can become a wound lodged in our personal psyche, my experience has been that humanity's pain can become a wound lodged within the deep structure of the collective psyche. Very much the same. So it's basically taking Jung's concept of the collective unconscious and simply adding to it a particular dynamic. And it's not just the wounds, well, that tends to be the more problematic, but it's all the great geniuses and the great acts of compassion, that those are also within the collective psyche, the great creativity. So the whole of human history dances within the collective psyche. But the part that we have the most difficulty digesting is the pain and suffering.
Sure.
Interesting. And then that leads into another question, which, you talked about the first level as therapeutic utilization. So what is it that all three of you feel is an experiential outcome of the healing process that this type of substance can bring forward?
Well, healing takes place at different levels, but there is, I think, a common quality that transcends those levels. Healing can take place at the personal level, at the mental level, at the physical level. It can heal physical wounds. It can take place at the soul level, the kind of the existential level, where you may not be in any personal psychological stress, but the deeper questions about whether life itself has any meaning whatsoever in a world where everything dies. Healing can take place at a collective level. Healing can take place at a deep, deep mystical level of cascading orders of intimacy with the divine itself. All of these different levels, I think, have in common the quality that in healing there is an experience of expanse, an experience of calm and peace, an experience of liberation. The scale and the context of those may vary, but what they have in common is this sense of infinite gratitude for being where one is and appreciation for all the conditions that have allowed this to take place.
Andrew, you want to address this?
No, that sounds beautiful. I'll go with that.
I think the only thing that I would add, and which I think you were saying though, is that there's a sense of union, communion, that you're literally in communion with. And you're not alone, you're not isolated. It's a part of a greater experience of wholeness. Whether, I grew up on a farm in Missouri, I love nature. It's just like, you got to be out there, you got to be doing that. And that communion, or it could be music, it could be a lot of other things, it could be people. But that connectivity, that's the exciting part. Shall we go to, go ahead, Bud.
We've got a couple of more questions that I think are interesting and important to get to. There are questions about where can I go to get a guided psychedelic experience? And those, so I don't know how appropriate that is for this particular conversation. Do any of you want to comment on that?
Well, right now, the only place where you can do this work legally is by participating in studies which are being done at Johns Hopkins, or there are about 8 universities in the United States that are doing psychedelic research, and that number is expanding every month, it seems. So right now, given the status of psychedelics, except ketamine, which is still legal, which is a different kind of psychedelic, you have to be part of one of these studies or other. Now, there is a large underground therapeutic psychedelic community, and there are non-psychedelic modalities which access similarly very intense evocative healing states of consciousness, specifically holotropic breath work, Stan and Groff's work, and those are being offered around the world. And they trigger states of consciousness which are similarly deeply evocative, deeply opening, and deeply healing. Right now we're on the cusp. I think every decade, in 10 years, you will have more, the lay public will have more access to legally sanctioned psychedelic, guided psychedelic therapeutic work. Right now, it's still very tightly controlled.
And the final question, John, basically kind of wraps up a number of them. They're all kind of dancing around the same topic. And that is the notion of, if we recognize from an ACI perspective that we are experiencing an illusion, is this not just another dance in the illusion and using magic to change the illusion, which is using the illusion to change the illusion?
You want to chuckle that one, Roger? You first.
That's great. I hadn't thought of it that way. Yes. Well, first off, let's acknowledge the course. Course says that that it's fine to use medicines medications if one has. That's where one is, and one, I forget the exact wording, but basically saying, okay, if you need them, take them. But I get, from that perspective, if this is a vast illusion called Maya in the Indian terms, vast illusion in the course's terms, then yes, anything within this is illusion, and some things lead out of illusion and some lead deeper into it. And I would just add to the discussion of that these substances, so much of the outcome depends on intention. Is the intention for spiritual awakening, etc. Used in that way, they can be very, very valuable. Do they open us to more illusion? Yes, within the course's framework, most of the experiences that emerge are perhaps more subtle, refined, more spiritual, more luminous, etc., but still within the vast illusion. And there is also the possibility that these substances can awaken us out of the illusion. And Chris, in some of his later chapters, particularly the Diamond something chapter, talks about being immersed in what he called kind of diamond luminosity, but interpreted as what in Tibetan Buddhism is called the Dharmakaya, or the awakened, the infinite awakened awareness. And so I think it is clearly possible for these substances. Well, then back up and say, I think that the most spiritual practices and most spiritual experiences and psychedelic experiences are still within the illusion, but they can be experiences which reveal the nature of illusion and allow us to peel away some of the layers of illusion and point the way beyond it. And some of the spiritual experiences and some psychedelic experiences are out of the illusion, beyond the illusion. They are a literal awakening or illumination.
Well said, Roger. Really.
Okay.
I'll make a suggestion for reframing or recontextualizing of this question. Because the statement that all existence is Maya or it's all an illusion comes about or enters in a time in history, I think, when we were in the early stages of discovering the mother universe that holds the daughter universe. So we were discovering the depth of spiritual reality. And when we first began to discover the sheer ecstasy of transcendent reality, how could we not but feel that we belong there more than here, that was real and this is not real, and that's home, and that's where we really want to get to. And all of the religions that were born in the axial age are basically up and out cosmologies. So the goal is to achieve some condition, salvation or enlightenment, and to basically, the goal is you don't want to have to come back into time and space. You want to go to the more real place, into the place where true spiritual fulfillment lies. And the implication is that it doesn't lie here. This world is not the place that totally satisfies the soul. And I think those cosmologies made perfectly good sense in the context of history in which they were born. But now that science has given us a much, much larger understanding of the complexity of our universe and the age of our universe and the size of our universe, to simply say that the goal is to get out of the illusion of time and space leaves unanswered the question: what is the purpose of time, space in itself? When the infinite was purely transcendent in the great fertile void, when the choice was made to manifest time and space, why did the creative intelligence do it? If only to create an obstacle course that would allow subsequently evolved beings to escape the illusion and transcend back into peace and wholeness of. And I think what's happening now is that we're making a pivot to a deeper vision. And the idea that time and space is an illusion, I understand the truth of that, and I affirm the truth of it. My sessions affirm the truth of that. But what is the purpose of the illusion? And particularly, what are the evolutionary opportunities that this illusion is providing for us? And here, I think we're moving into a time when we're beginning to realize that the goal of evolution and the goal of reincarnation and the goal of awakening is not simply to achieve an escape velocity so that we can return to pure peace of transcendence, but the goal is to wake up inside time and space so that we can incorporate more and more spiritual awareness, more and more transcendental wholeness into the human condition, so that truly we can live heaven on earth. And when we waken up completely intact to heaven on earth, when we penetrate the illusion here, there is not as much of a need to go elsewhere. And I think this is the larger evolutionary agenda. Is not that there isn't an illusory quality to time and space. There is, but we can penetrate that illusion. We can ground our experience inside that illusion in deep spiritual reality. And in that process, we can co-create with the creative principle a more and more spiritually realized world inside time and space. And when we do that, it affects us. It makes us strong in a way that affects us far beyond the implications of any incarnation or any set of incarnations. That we are undergoing a transformational process, an educational process, a deepening process that will change us forever when we eventually decide to leave time and space behind, if we decide to do that.
That's absolutely beautiful, Chris. And I want to say that A Course of Love also pulls that same thread of creating heaven on earth and expressing it as that. And that notion of, and it doesn't say this in ACIM, but a lot of students pull the notion of the universe was created as an act of separation.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't really say that. And ACOL says, no, it wasn't created as an act of separation. It was an extension of love, because that's all that God can do. Mm-hmm. And it was an extension of love. And then in the illusion, we shifted.
Mm-hmm.
we're the ones that went to the dark side, so to speak, within the illusion. And our awakening is to go all the way back to the truth of we are the co-creators of all of this.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So in our remaining time, Bud, should we open the floor to whoever would like to?
I know Lynn has very patiently held up her hand. She probably wants to share something lovely with us.
Okay, very good.
Oh my God, thank you so much. This was amazing. And I am extremely, extremely grateful. I wrote a poem, a short one. I wrote it for today. I call it short but sweet.
Oh.
Past conditioned minds, we are together. Nothing needed as the whole. Listen to whispers not familiar. They remember who we are. Trust fills space where doubt has left. One who knows is always here.
Lovely.
Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you.
Very nice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Who else?
There is a question about, will this recording be made available? Yes.
Yes.
We will do some light editing and then it'll be posted up on John Mundy's YouTube site.
Mhm.
And I'll put that link in chat.
You know, if there's a gap here, I'd like to circle back to Roger's observation that psychedelics are very good at breaking us into larger and larger experiential realms, but they aren't necessarily good at helping us integrate those experiences, and integrating those experiences can be as demanding and is as important as breaking out into those realms. And I'm really pleased to see that there's more and more discussion of integration in the psychotherapeutic literature. And there's a book coming out from Inner Traditions, a collection of essays on psychotherapy and psychedelics, which is specifically focused on this theme of integration and the challenges of integration. So to me, that is a major issue, especially if you want to work with psychedelics in any systematic fashion. It's not enough to have a set and setting on the day of the session that gives you good access. It's also very important to have a container of spiritual practices and a container of a grounded lifestyle in which you can hold those experiences and integrate them and extract the marrow of those experiences. Otherwise, powerful experiences come and go, but they don't necessarily leave much of a lasting imprint. To really absorb these experiences, and this is why, I mean, I've been a meditator all my life and a Vajrayana practitioner in the last couple of decades. And I consider that if you're going to enter into temporary expansions of consciousness, the deeper you're going to go in that direction, the more important it is to have a daily spiritual practice, a practice of the body, a practice of the mind, of strong social commitments, of commitment to social service, of compassion, because the insights and the energies that move through you in a psychedelic session are so powerful and they are so disruptive that you need the grounding and the support of a daily spiritual practice just to weather them. And then secondly, to extract the maximum value for your own soul's development. So, yeah.
Ditto to that. One of the advantages of the course, you got the daily lessons, but I always conclude it with something else besides the daily lessons, you know, doing some yoga, things like that. But you got some, maybe want to ask a question?
Yeah, there's a couple of questions that we haven't gotten to that are still here that I'd love to explore. Okay, so related to your question about psychedelics in general, are there dangers involved? And there is this notion of bad trips, and is that perhaps why we see some of the more classic religions and belief systems advise away from them?
Roger, do you want to address the issue of the screening criteria in psychedelic work?
Sure, I can say a little bit about that. Yes, there are definitely some people who should not take them to begin with. Anyone with a history of firstly, let's just assume that the sessions are being done under optimal conditions in supportive conditions, set and setting. If people have significant psychological disorders, that they're being done with clinical support. But there are basically some people probably should not be doing, or anyone with a history of psychosis, manic depressive disorder. I've seen a number of people, including professional mental health people, get into trouble who have some sort of manic depressive disorder. So those are kind of serious warning signs. And of course, optimal conditions, a wise companion, at the very least, ideally a clinical person if you're working with therapeutically. So those are some of the caveats.
Yeah. Yeah, and those criteria, those screening criteria are really important and are used in all the studies which are being done in the renaissance of psychedelic therapy. Now, to address the second and third questions, I don't think the religious caution about psychedelics or the advice not to use it is because of bad trips. I think in the Buddhism, you find this in the principle, do not take drugs which cloud the mind, because they are distractions and you want to uncover the core existential problems that we are avoiding in our life that continue to cause suffering in our life. And this is why, for me, even though I've been a student of many world's religions as a professor and love them all, but particularly as a Buddhist, I have never considered my psychedelic work as incompatible with that injunction, do not take drugs which cloud the mind, because when psychedelics are taken therapeutically, they don't cloud the mind. They amplify the mind. And if you engage that heightened state of consciousness in a truly spiritual manner, in a truly therapeutically focused manner, you bring forward these knots and you can heal those problems and you can bring greater clarity and understanding to your mind. Now, bad trips. People can have bad trips for any number of reasons. They can have bad trips because they took psychedelics in an inappropriate context, or they were not prepared for the avalanche that broke open inside their consciousness, or they're at a concert and they're at a social situation where there's a lot of other things going on and you get complications. But when you are working in a controlled environment, when you are working in a therapeutic environment where you are safe, where you are physically safe and psychologically safe, and you're working with professionals who can provide you with a supportive context, in that context, one can have horrendously bad trips. One can have terribly, terribly frightening bad trips. In my experience, a bad trip, what people call a bad trip, is always when it's used in a carefully structured therapeutic setting, it's always a purification taking place. It's a purification, something is rising in your awareness that you'd rather not look at, you'd rather not face. It may be personal, it may be something in your incarnational history, it may be something in the collective psyche of humanity, but there's some terrible pain which is coming forward. If you open yourself and let this bad trip take you where it wants to take you, and again, I'm not talking about recreational use of psychedelics, but this confrontation with suffering, my experience is if you let it take you where it wants to go, it will build and it'll take you eventually through a threshold. It'll take you through a breakdown and a breakthrough, and it will deliver you into a world that lies beyond this suffering. So to me, a bad trip is a good trip. And I have spent, out of my 73 sessions, I can't tell you how many of those have involved terrible bad trips or bad aspects or bad suffering, because that is the nature of the cycle. Purification, confrontation, liberation, ecstasy. More purification, more confrontation, more breakthroughs, deeper ecstasy and insight. And that's the natural cycle. And all mystical traditions know this. The dark night of the soul in the Christian tradition, in the meditative and contemplative traditions, one encounters some samskaras, the conditionings which keep your consciousness tight and constricted. So this confrontation with darkness in different forms is part of the natural dynamic of spiritual practice when it's done conscientiously.
Yeah, yes, and maybe I can just add a very important principle in both spiritual practice and psychotherapy, that if one resists an experience, it is experienced as a problem, as painful, as traumatic, as something to be avoided. If one is able to open to it, to the experience, and feel it fully, then it is healed and released and becomes an opportunity and a breakthrough. And in spiritual language, Chris mentioned he's a Vajrayana practitioner, a form of Buddhism. In that tradition, it would be called turning obstacles into the path. So are there challenges? Of course, but bad trips, I think Chris has said very nicely, ideally will be reframed as challenging opportunities for opening and liberation. John, maybe I can just, there's a topic we haven't talked about. Is there a place for these substances in aiding study of A Course in Miracles? In one sense, the larger conversation has all been about that, that these substances can be adjuncts to an ongoing spiritual practice. But more specifically for working with the Course, if what, and like Chris, I don't necessarily advocate these substances, but for those who are explorers using them, then there are skillful ways of combining both approaches. And one is particularly to listen to readings of the Course while in an altered state. And what happens then is people find that firstly, it goes in deeper, and more profound levels of implications become apparent, and one opens to and can also merge with or identify more easily with some of the profound states that are being transmitted. And even perhaps have an experience of merging with the source. So that seems to be a very skillful way of combining these practices. And then, of course, if one does the substances independently, one may find that that lines from the Course come through the mind, the heart, and transform and illuminate it. And one can also integrate what one has done with the Course. And then after a session, it can be very valuable to go back to the Course. And somehow it always seems that what's in the Course is speaking to those experiences and illuminating and enriching them. So there can be a beautiful dynamic, mutually facilitating and supportive interplay between both approaches and practices.
Well, as I said in the very, very beginning, in my experience a long time ago, 76 in Bonn, that was, although I had the Course already, I wasn't buying I'm not a body, there's no world, no time thing. And then after that, I understood that. Much better. Yeah, much better. Yeah. Maybe we don't have a lot of time left, but I think that Theodore, do you want to come on by any chance, Theodore, and ask a question that I see that you've been raising, which is relevant here, which is, in terms of A Course in Miracles, could this be considered magic? By that I mean, the Course is it's not something that you use. It's something that has to occur as a part of natural development. I mean, that's kind of the same question we were addressing already. Do you understand? You understand the question? Is it kind of magic?
Yes, I do. I think, but you correct me if I don't.
Oh,
And I think it's not a matter of the substances themselves. It's a matter of how the substances are used.
okay.
Again, these are amplifiers of consciousness. And once you amplify consciousness, then how you hold that amplified state of consciousness, whether you fritter it away in simply egoic fantasies that end up reinforcing your prison inside the illusion, or whether you use it to confront those things inside you which are keeping you small and keeping you tied to repetitive scripts that are not life deepening, life expanding. Those are very different undertakings. And I don't think the question is really whether these are outside substances or, they're chemicals that you ingest, because when you meditate, you change your neurophysiology.
Yeah.
When you fast, you change your neurophysiology. You're changing your biochemistry. It's a matter, I think, of the attitude, whether you are doing this in a way which is responsible and results in a clarifying of consciousness, a healing of consciousness, and a deeper communion with the truth of life and with the substance of life. That, I think, is not magic, as I understand it. But you correct me if I'm not understanding the question.
I think you understand it. And I think too, and both of you, I think, would probably agree. If you study the life of Jesus, I mean, there's no ministry until after the 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness, during which time he's fasting. Buddha sitting under the Bodhi tree all those years, Mahavira is fasting. Muhammad is sitting in a cave, not eating. All this there's a physiological dimension that's going on with a psychological experience. And I don't think that should surprise us that that's part of what's going on. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when you take psychedelics, if you take them in a spiritual manner, you actually accelerate a physical, psychological purification process. There's no end run around it and getting cheap grace. There is only an intensification of the purification, which then gives you maybe a little greater access to something that lies beyond. And the purifications are intense. They are the same purifications that show up in monastic context and shamanic context, and sometimes worse because they are accelerated. But it's all about purification, because in the end, you end up back where you started. You end up in the deepest psychedelic states, in your natural mind, with the mind that you began the journey with. But what's different is that your natural mind is free to express itself completely, whereas in the beginning it was encumbered and restricted and constricted. But that mind which you are born into is the same mind that you were born into this world with. I mean, the enlightened traditions, the non-dual traditions are very, very clear. There is a dimension of your being which does not begin, does not end. It's never been obstructed. It is always sitting in its absolute purity at the center of every moment that you are aware, every moment you exist. When one touches into and wakens to that reality, you have brought the circle completely full around. You are where you started, except that you don't have the obstructions. Right. And that to me that's awakening, not magic.
Yeah. Awakening is what we're looking for, isn't it? That's what all the traditions talk about. Right? Yeah. Believe it or not, we are very near the end of our time. In fact, we are at the end of our time. And it's just been wonderful sharing this time with the two of you talking about something that I think is really important to talk about.
Can I add one little point, John?
Sure, go ahead.
I think that there is a very large corollary here that one can share with a near-death experience.
Oh,
That
yeah.
in itself is a huge awakening, and it's just yet another way to put that road bump, if you will, on our normal unconscious state, and then all of a sudden take us to another state of awareness where we can see ourselves and see the truth of who we are.
Right. I think that's probably in your experience too, Chris, that there's probably more similarity between these two experiences
Yeah.
than most others. And keep in mind that when somebody's having a near-death experience, there's some physiological stuff going on.
You think?
I taught near-death episode research for years at my university, and Ken Ring is a good friend, and I used his work in my courses for years.
Right.
And among all the various people that I feel the closest connection with, it's actually the people in the near-death community
Mhm.
that I have the most natural resonance with, because their experiences most deeply resonate with my own experiences.
Mhm.
Right.
And
So maybe this becomes again a way of dying before you die.
Yes.
And perhaps very quickly, just to give a larger context for our conversation and the evolution of our times, it's really intriguing to find that at this time there are new teachings such as the Course emerging, which are reaching millions of people, but there are also some other unanticipated ways of inducing transcendent states, which probably none of us could have imagined. One of some of the mind-brain feedback machines. Others are space travel and the so-called overview effect. The number of astronauts have had transcendent experiences. Third is resuscitation technology that has allowed the millions of people to have near-death experiences. And fourth is psychedelics. And who would have imagined any of these? But here we are with all of them. And aren't we graced?
Yeah.
We are graced.
Yeah. Yeah.
I might add, by the way, that I've just been reading, almost done with, it's taken forever, this book, which really shows that the mortality key, that what we're talking about here has been going on like forever. I mean, going back as far as you can go back into 2000 BC, they were doing this stuff, right? And it's always been happening. And I'm sure you guys, both the shamans have been working with this sort of stuff for ages as well. In that sense, there's nothing new here. Well, Roger and Chris, thank you guys so much for taking the time to come be with us this afternoon.
John,
Really
I want to
appreciate it.
salute your courage for bringing psychedelics into the community, into the Course in Miracles community. I think that's a gutsy thing. I really appreciate the opportunity to dialogue that you've created here, and I hope only good comes from it.
Well, thank you. I hope so. I felt like I had to step out, and so here we are.
Great.
We usually end by reading the Lord's Prayer from A Course in Miracles, which we'll put on the screen. Somebody want to volunteer to do that? Or Bud, would you like to do that for us? Maybe?
Sure. And
We'll
I
come
can,
back into full screen and say goodbye to each other. Go ahead, Bud.
yeah, so this is, and after this is a good time to move into gallery view. So, yeah. The Lord's Prayer from A Course in Miracles. Forgive us our illusions, Father, and help us to accept true relationship with you, in which there are no illusions and where none can ever enter. Our holiness is yours. What can there be in us that needs forgiveness when yours is perfect? The sleep of forgetfulness is only the unwillingness to remember your forgiveness and your love. Let us not wander into temptation, for the temptation of the Son of God is not your will. And let us receive only what you have given and accept but this into the minds which you've created and which you love. Amen.
Amen.